Hello everyone, and welcome to our training on strategies for diffusing and preventing challenging behaviors. The majority of the content that we'll review today is taken from the sources listed here. Hi, I'm Jeremy Sillenperry. I put a picture of myself on here so that you can put a face with the voice that you'll be hearing for the duration of this presentation. Here are the outcomes that we hope to achieve by the end of our time together. We'll spend a little time reviewing some basic behavioral terminology, and then we'll move into the 7 phases of escalation. Once we have a better understanding of escalation, we'll discuss ways to prevent negative behaviors, and then what to do when we see those behaviors in our classrooms. So we have an entire Padlet of resources that you can access today or after today if you'd like to dive a little more deeply into the content. But for today, we'll just need one thing along with the videos that you're watching. You can take a moment to use this QR code or the bit.ly to access that Padlet. Once you've opened it, take a look at the first column on your left. There's 2 things. You'll see the slide deck, and then you'll see a form entitled Behavior Response Intervention Plan. You'll use that Behavior Response Intervention Plan throughout the training, so you can either print that out or download it. Any good behavioral presentation should begin with at least a brief review of some basic behavioral terms. We'll take a few slides to review the A, B, and C's, what they stand for, so that we can better understand behavior. So think back to an interaction that you've had with a student that was escalated into what you might call a meltdown. Now that you have that incident kind of in your mind, think about a few things. Was the outcome of that interaction that you had what you had expected? How did you feel about those outcomes? And if you could have kind of a do-over, what would you do differently? Notice that I didn't ask what the student would do differently. What would you do differently as the adult managing the situation? I want you to keep that in mind as we move through today's training. Here are the basic behavioral terms that we need to understand in order to understand the root of all behavior. These terms and principles hold true for the behaviors that we like to see and for those that we would like to see less of. It's also important to understand that in behavior land, the term consequence doesn't necessarily mean something negative. A lot of times in educational circles, we say consequences when what we really mean is some type of punitive traditional punishment. We say things like the student received a consequence for throwing that pencil. We'll discuss each of these terms in a little more detail, but I think it's important to make that distinction before we move on. So it's definitely one of the most important and general principles of behavior to understand that the more we can work on preventing negative behaviors, the less we'll have to deal with later. So that's always kind of our goal. Our first principle of behavior is what we call an antecedent. Antecedents are the things that happen right before the behaviors we're looking at. If a student completes a task you've asked them to do, something happened right before that. If a student throws a pencil, something happened right before that. Paying attention to antecedents helps us use preventative measures to make it less likely that we see inappropriate behaviors that we're concerned about. If a student becomes aggressive every time the fire alarm goes off, we can make sure that the student is, say, outside of the building on a quick walk when we know the fire alarm is going to go off. Now, ultimately, our goal is for that student to be able to tolerate a fire alarm, but we begin to incorporate coping strategies such as using noise-canceling headphones, but initially we might want to completely avoid an antecedent, especially if it leads to something unsafe. We also do this for little things all the time. When you know 2 students tend to talk a lot, we move their seats. Little did we know we were using a strategy called antecedent control. Our next general behavioral term is the term behavior. Behaviors are those observable and measurable things that a person does. Take a look at some non-examples listed on this slide. I know that at different times I've used language like this, but ultimately it's not describing behavior. Behavior only refers to things that are measurable. So how many times did it happen? How long did it happen? And it has to be observable, meaning it describes an act or not an emotion or demeanor. That's kind of some of our bad non-examples on the right side. And those examples on the right side, those non-examples, also tend to come off a little more judgmental than we need them to be. So staying on the topic of behavior, when we talk about specific behavior, we pay attention to 2 different things to help us understand and ultimately intervene. The first is the form or the topography. This is the specific action like closing a fist or writing with a pencil. The second thing that we look at is the function. The function describes what a person gets out of displaying that specific behavior. The form is the way a behavior looks. It's what we observe. It's a description of the behavior, whereas the function is the purpose that the behavior serves. As school staff, we tend to look at and worry about the form of the behavior because it's the thing that we see in our classrooms. It's the thing that's disrupting our learning. And that makes sense, but ultimately the function is the more important factor. If we know why a student engages in a specific behavior, we can create an environment where they are more or less likely to display a behavior. This also helps us intervene in a way that is more effective. Let's think about a student who runs. Maybe they're running because they want you to chase them. This gives them adult attention. If they're running to truly get away from the adult, then our intervention is going to be very different than in our first example. Our last behavioral term that we'll talk about here is consequence. So let's remember that the term consequence in this capacity doesn't have any kind of positive or negative connotation. A consequence is not necessarily a bad thing. A consequence is simply an event that happens directly after a behavior, and it makes that behavior more or less likely to happen in the future. Basically, if I like what happens after I do something, I'm more likely to do it again. If I don't like what happens, then I'm less likely to do it again. Consequences are also put into two categories: reinforcement and punishment. If a consequence makes a behavior more likely to occur in the future, then it's reinforcement. If it makes a behavior less likely to occur, then it's punishment. Consequences are constantly happening to all of us all day long. Every behavior that is displayed, from brushing your teeth to complex tasks like driving in a car, are receiving consequences and are being shaped by either punishment or reinforcement constantly. So what does that mean for schools? We've learned through behavioral research that the most effective way to reduce negative behaviors is to make sure we're effectively reinforcing the reciprocal behavior. If we want a student to stop calling out, we have to reinforce being quiet. If we want to stop a student from getting out of their area, we have to reinforce being in their area. All that being said, we're still going to have students who display negative behaviors, and we're still going to have students who end up in crisis. Behavioral change is often slow, especially at the start of an intervention. Typically, if we have a rapid change in behavior based on an intervention, the change won't be lasting, or we've inadvertently reinforced something negative. Another thing to remember is that when we're talking about reinforcement and punishment, our efforts are as much, if not more, about the next time we see the behavior of concern. It's about making the behavior less likely to occur, as much as it is about ending it in the moment. This can be an understandably frustrating part of managing student behaviors. We want negative things to stop quickly, but this is the reality of how behavior is learned and shaped over time. Now that we have a good handle on these terms, think of a student who you are currently working with who displays behaviors that you don't like. Use this form or even a piece of paper to map out what the typical antecedent and consequences are for these behaviors. Remember that the consequence is not necessarily a punishment that's been doled out, it's simply the thing that happens after a behavior. So if a student says a swear word and his peers laugh and you give them a detention, it's the peers laughing that's the consequence, not the detention. Take a few minutes to think this through and jot this down. You might want to pause this for a moment to get your thoughts on paper. In this next section, we'll review the 7 phases of escalation. We'll also look at some things that we can do to prevent further escalation. Before we get into those phases, we should mention a few things. First of all, the idea of escalation and the process of de-escalation is not a special ed thing. Any person, notice I didn't specifically say students, can go through this process of escalation and hopefully de-escalation. Even though everyone is different and different triggers and stressors affect everyone differently, we all go through the same pattern of escalation. If you take a look at our slide here, we see our student at the top. Maybe he's feeling impulsive or acting out, or in some ways acting hostile. That affects the teacher. As we go around this cycle here, now the student's behavior is making the teacher feel maybe a bit attacked, maybe disrespected, and so they in some ways accept that challenge, and then the teacher kind of ups the ante, accepts the challenge, and now they're increasing their, in some ways, hostility, and that leads to, kind of a fight or flight response from the teacher, which further escalates the student. And you can see if we don't intervene properly, this cycle will continue to just go around and around and around. And ultimately, it's our job as the adults to stop this kind of crisis cycle before it really truly escalates. Hopefully you had a chance to either print or download this form. As we go through the phases of escalation, we'll be using this to map out what it looks like for both you and the student. We'll be watching a few brief videos as we go along. Like I stated earlier, even though everyone experiences stress and triggers differently, we do all follow the same pattern of escalation. You'll notice that some students travel through the phases in a matter of moments and others in a matter of hours. But overall, the pattern remains the same. Our job during the process is to keep students from traveling to the next phase. It is possible for a student to get to the agitation phase, let's say, and then move right to recovery, if we were able to intervene quickly and effectively. The first phase, and the phase that we want students to remain in, is what we call calm. Now understand that calm can look differently for different students, but overall, this is what a student would look like on an average good day, on a day when things are going well and there's no real outside stressors directly affecting them. Now we're going to use the form that you've either downloaded or printed for today. In a moment, you'll see a video showing example student Nora. Take a few moments to fill in what the student and adult are doing during that clip.
All right, friends, you've had time to check your homework. What questions do you have? Yes, Jordan.
Can you show me how you solved number 3?
Number 3, sure. Let's see, we have 40 times 3. Remember, we always start multiplying with the digit in the ones place. So we have 3 times 0. What is 3 times 0?
3 times 0 equals 0.
Yes, 3 times 0 equals 0. And where do we write the 0 in our answer?
In the ones place.
Nice.
So what we see here of Nora in the calm phase is that she is oriented toward the teacher and the instruction that's happening. She has her materials out on her desk. She seems to be using them appropriately for the most part, and has her eyes forward as well. So it could be that a student's body is oriented the right way, but they're looking away, and that could be a sign that they're not calm. But Nora appears to be alert and engaged based on this body language. And it's important for Mr. Santini to notice that, because we have already established, as you heard in the challenge scenario, that Nora has a hard time when her peers are asking questions. So that's going on here. And so a teacher should be, Mr. Santini should be looking and saying, oh, this is a challenging situation for Nora. Okay, her actions show me that she's calm right now, versus demonstrating signs of a trigger.
During the calm phase, our goal is to keep students productively engaged with instruction and learning in order to prevent behavior problems or escalation of behaviors. We know that when students are on task, challenged, and achieving academically, and they're successful, there is less likelihood of problem behaviors. Quality instruction is a crucial factor in preventing problems. Remember that students who are participating in engaging activities are far less likely to display inappropriate behaviors. There are a few things beyond quality instruction that can help us maintain our students at this baseline phase. So things you can do, like maintaining positive relationships with all students, structure time and space, predictability is our friend here, teach for active engagement and success, attend to appropriate behaviors, so that means for every one negative interaction that you might have with a student, you should look to have 5 positive interactions, and provide contingent and non-contingent attention, meaning sometimes I'm giving good attention based on good behavior, and other times I'm just doing it to show a student that I care about them. The second phase is called the trigger phase. As the name implies, some sort of outside stressor has resulted in a student beginning to escalate. A trigger, by definition, is an event that sets off that cycle of acting out that we reviewed earlier. Understand that this event may be directly tied to what is happening in your classroom, but could also be tied to things with little or nothing to do with what's going on in school. As we explore each phase of escalation, you'll see that we have a goal associated with each phase. Our goal here is to prevent behavior problems. If we witness a trigger, we have 3 steps to take to keep a student's behavior on track. The first step is to recognize when something is a trigger. Just as trauma affects everyone differently, so do triggers. 2 students could experience the same situation and have it affect them very differently. The second step is to use some strategies to mitigate the effects of the trigger, and we'll discuss some of those in a moment. The last step is to work on non-school-based triggers as much as we can. We may not be able to address or fix every situation, but even making things a little better or showing a student that we care enough to follow up can build relationships and then make the behaviors less likely to occur in the future. So some strategies to manage school-based triggers. So you can brainstorm ideas with the student, adjust the classroom environment to limit triggers, like changing seating arrangement, things like that. You can role play expected behaviors in a scenario that's commonly triggers those behaviors you don't like. You can use pre-correction, so before you see or you're likely to see a behavior you don't like, you can discuss the appropriate behavior. You can quickly address challenging behaviors after they occur through redirection and reinforcing of the good expectations. Teacher proximity, so just being close to students tends to keep them on task. You can refocus the student's attention by asking them to do a task such as reading or answering a question, assist the student in getting started if a task seems hard for them, or temporarily remove the student from a setting to give them time to regain composure. Little tasks and jobs like, can you take this envelope to the office, are great to help accomplish that. So now we're going to take a look at Nora again, and I want you to record what the adult and the student behaviors look like. As you watch the video, remember that there is some unmet need or unresolved problem that is occurring for Nora. In general, students may look restless, frustrated, or anxious. There are typically some physical indicators that we can pick up on if we're paying attention.
3 times 0 equals 0. Next, we need to multiply 3 times the digit in the tens place, which is 4. What do we do next?
Multiply 3 times 4, which is 12.
Nice. 3 times 4 is 12. And there we go.
Now, instruction has continued, and peers are continuing to work through questions with Mr. Santini. And we do see signs that it's starting to take its toll on Nora, and her feelings and her behavior here. So she's kind of starting to make a little noise, look away from the instruction and the peer who's talking with the teacher, rolling her eyes. And these are all signals that an escalation is beginning. And it's pretty important here that Mr. Santini notice and intervene before the escalation continues. And if he were to do so, he should do so, or the way he could intervene that's most likely to have an effect is one that allows Nora to move on so that she doesn't have to wait while her peers ask these silly questions.
At this point, you should have both the calm and trigger phases filled in here for Nora. Sometimes we can miss a trigger, or sometimes a student is escalating so quickly that they're moving already into the next phase, which is what we call agitation. Agitation, by definition, is when a student's behavior continues to deteriorate when triggers are not successfully managed. Behavior can continue to escalate and become difficult to manage at this point. While you attempt to de-escalate students, remember to bear in mind those ideas and principles you have learned regarding student trauma. Many of the strategies and priorities during the next few phases directly tie into trauma-informed practices. So things that we can do to help calm students are provide assurance and additional time, reduce situational demands, again, teacher proximity. Independent activities or passive activities, or sometimes for some students, movement activities are good. And then students self-managed. So again, these are things that maybe we previously taught them to help themselves calm down. Let's watch Nora go through the agitation phase. You'll notice that she is now disconnected from learning, and so our priorities must shift as well. Until she's emotionally regulated, we won't be able to get back to teaching and learning.
Yes, Colin.
Can you look at mine?
Yes, I will be right there. Nora, I don't know why you're being so rude today. What's going on?
This is a waste of my time.
Excuse me, you need to speak to me with respect.
So now, after the trigger has gone unaddressed, we see Nora's behavior escalating. She's appearing to be more restless. A teacher, Mr. Santini, approaches her and says, what's going on today? Why are you being so rude? And she says, this is a waste of my time, which obviously is a more rude response. And at that point, he reminds her that it's inappropriate to speak to others in that manner. Now, I want to point out that there's a lot that's good about how Mr. Santini responds here. He's responding to her somewhat privately. He's approached her desk and he's speaking in a quiet tone. While it's likely that some members of the class can hear it, he's not addressing her in front of the whole class publicly. So this kind of helps to protect her dignity, and that can help keep things under control. It can. In addition, he's using a kind tone, even though he's reprimanding her and sort of pressing her and being reactive in that way. He's not speaking harshly to her. So those things are really good. Speaking privately with the student, using as gentle a tone, but firm as is reasonable. But the problem is he is simply reacting to what she's saying and doing, and basically telling her to stop doing that and that it's inappropriate, instead of trying to address the need that is leading to Nora's behavior, which is a wish to move on more quickly, a wish to not have to sit there while her peers ask questions that she already knows the answer to.
A quick note here as we move farther up the escalation model. Adult emotions and adult regulation are extremely important from here on out. A dysregulated, emotionally escalated adult cannot de-escalate a student. There will be times when behaviors have our blood pressure raised, but in the words of my wonderful classroom aide, sometimes you have to fake it till you make it. This always makes me think of a duck swimming on a pond. Under the surface, their legs are going like crazy, but up top, where you can see, it's calm, cool, and collected. Despite our best efforts, there are times when students will enter the next phase. Acceleration, and as its name implies, this phase is taking us very close to that fifth phase, or what I would call full-blown crisis. It's important for us to intervene quickly and effectively so that we can avoid any further escalation. Here in the acceleration phase, students' behaviors become more focused in an effort to engage others. A big difference here is that escalation is starting to feel more personal, and students are attempting to pull others into their distress. During the agitation phase, you might hear things like, "This work is stupid." Now you're going to hear things like, "You're stupid." Behaviors will begin to target others in an attempt to have others dysregulated as well. There are a few things that we can do to help our students begin to calm down and hopefully not reach that crisis level. The first thing is to avoid escalating prompts. Remember that at this point, our student is fully disengaged from the learning process, and so our priorities have also shifted away from academics or task demands. If we begin to remind students of how much work they have to do, or how far they're starting to fall behind, or if we begin to focus on punitive consequences, we'll most likely escalate the student that we're working with. Remember that earlier slide when we thought about what outcomes we wanted? This is where that becomes really important. Yes, work has to be completed, but only after our students have had a chance to de-escalate and switch back on that portion of the brain that deals with rational thought and new learning. So things that we can do is avoid escalating prompts, maintain a calm, respectful, and detached demeanor ourselves. Detached meaning we're not getting our feathers ruffled when students say negative things. You want to approach the student in a non-threatening manner and use non-confrontational limit setting. So that might look like, why don't you take a few minutes in the calming corner and then I'll come check on you. So it's important to know what triggers might affect our students. If we look in the middle of this slide, you'll see acceleration behaviors. This is what it could look like for a kid at this phase. You'll see that they start to badger you for things, repeat questions over and over again. They might use some physical intimidation or threats. You'll hear the martyrdom. Why is this happening to me? You don't like me. You might get the opposite, where kids start to butter up, overly complimentary things, or become physical. So some strategies that we can implement, you see there is ignore the content of the behavior. So don't respond to the youth as they're trying to pull you into their escalation cycle. It's our job to stay outside of that. B, we could teach the original behavior, so kind of keeping them to stay on topic. You see the bullet points there. It says specific error correction, where we're going to specifically talk about the positive behaviors we want to see. We can remind students of regulation routines at this point. Again, hopefully those are things that have been previously taught. And then a big one, especially if kids get really close to crisis, is just to offer them space and time to help them self-regulate. Here's Nora once again. This video shows her during the acceleration phase, where she will really interfere with her own learning and that of the whole class.
Yes, Colin.
Can you look at mine?
Yes, I will be right there. Nora, I don't know why you're being so rude today. What's going on?
This is a waste of my time.
Excuse me, you need to speak to me with respect.
So now, after the trigger has gone unaddressed, we see Nora's behavior escalating. She's appearing to be more restless. A teacher, Mr. Santini, approaches her and says, what's going on today? Why are you being so rude? And she says, "This is a waste of my time," which obviously is a more rude response. And at that point, he reminds her that it's inappropriate to speak to others in that manner. Now, I want to point out that there's a lot that's good about how Mr. Santini responds here. He's responding to her somewhat privately. He's approached her desk and he's speaking in a quiet tone. While it's likely that some members of the class can hear it, he's not addressing her in front of the whole class publicly. So this kind of helps to protect her dignity, and that can help keep things under control. It can. In addition, he's using a kind tone, even though he's reprimanding her and sort of pressing her and being reactive in that way. He's not speaking harshly to her. So those things are really good. Speaking privately with the student, using as gentle a tone, but firm as is reasonable. But the problem is he is simply reacting to what she's saying and doing, and basically telling her to stop doing that and that it's inappropriate, instead of trying to address the need that is leading to Nora's behavior, which is a wish to move on more quickly, a wish to not have to sit there while her peers ask questions that she already knows the answer to.
If you haven't already, take some time to catch up on your form. Make sure you've got your observations for both students and staff recorded up through the fourth phase, acceleration. Here we are, phase 5, peak, or what I sometimes just call full-on crisis. This is arguably the most distressing phase because the behaviors that you are now seeing are unpredictable and often dangerous. It is also difficult because you may have been working through all of those previous strategies discussed to no avail. Our goal here, first and foremost, is safety. This takes precedence over every other priority until de-escalation is fully underway. Here are some things that we can do to help begin the process of de-escalation. The first thing to do is remember to be the thermostat and not the thermometer. A thermometer goes up and down depending on the situation, while the thermostat sets the temperature for the room. If you are calm and in control, your class will be better able to listen and follow important directions, and the student you are de-escalating will be more successful as well. So you want to make sure you're speaking to your students in a calm voice. Limit your verbal communication so as not to overwhelm students with requests or processing of lots of rapid speech. Be understanding and compassionate above all things. We discussed earlier that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Something similar is going on here. Chances are we know which students are most likely to ever enter into phase 5. So be as proactive as possible. Make safety the top priority. Pause instruction to address behavior when needed, and make sure you're familiar with the school's procedures for addressing student behavior, especially if that student has some kind of specific positive behavior support plan or specially designed instruction. Contacting the appropriate people to help if there is a dangerous situation, and then documenting the incident afterwards. Take some time to watch Nora through this next phase. Now, Nora is obviously an actor. We would never record actual students in crisis, but you can still notice those student and staff behaviors that are so important to understand during this phase.
Last call for questions, otherwise we're going to get started on today's warm-up.
So annoying. I hate this class.
Take this to Miss Chen's, please. Class, let's line up at the door and go next door to Miss Chen's, just like we practiced.
To his great credit, Mr. Santini notices relatively quickly that Nora's behavior has reached peak or crisis level. And we know that because she has now become disruptive to property and aggressive toward property. And so a teacher's first priority at this point is to keep everybody safe. So what Mr. Santini does is, you can see him here handing off a crisis card that communicates to a nearby teacher that they will be absorbing his class for a while the situation is brought under control. So a student takes this to another teacher, and then the class files out. And you'll notice that they filed out in an orderly manner, and which suggests they've practiced this before. So a really important part of any classroom management plan is to teach and have students practice, and I consider that part of teaching, what to do in a crisis, or a safety or crisis plan. It's called different things in different places. So safety or crisis plan, in teaching it, Mr. Santini didn't need to say, oh, if Nora or Jordan or some other student in the room gets dangerous, this is what you'll do. There are a lot of scenarios in which something like this can be helpful. And including a fire drill, right? So we need to teach procedures for students to exit the room safely. And so they do that. And again, it's important that stuff is taught in advance. After that happens, you'll see that, or you saw that Mr. Santini gives Nora some space. He doesn't approach her. He just waits. He's still in the room, even though the class has gone to another teacher's room. But he doesn't interact with Nora. And what she does is kind of her behavior peters out. She stops kicking and pushing things, and eventually sits down on the floor.
Well, we've implemented those strategies to help our student begin to come down out of crisis in the peak phase. We've started some true de-escalation, which is phase 6. So how can we tell de-escalation is happening? Well, we'll see a reduction or a cessation in student aggression, or even just the intensity of a behavior. We'll see a reduced frequency or intensity of the things that we're seeing, and some students may even begin to appear confused. During this phase, a student needs time to cool down so that they can integrate into the classroom and back into task demands. So things that we can do: give the student some space. Sometimes we can just resume the regular schedule. We can provide an independent activity, debrief or discuss with the student, and then restore the actual environment the student is going into, and if there was some papers thrown or things like that. Take some time to watch Nora work through the de-escalation phase, paying attention to some of the bullets on this slide. So she may look confused or withdrawn. Some students deny any responsibility or involvement. They might attempt to blame others. They may try to reconcile with those they've harmed, or begin to comply with explicit directions. In some cases, refuse to discuss the incident.
Nora, I see you're feeling upset. Do you want to go to the peace corner and do some deep breathing? Okay, good call. Thank you. Hey, Nora, how you feeling?
A little better.
Oh, yeah? Well, if you're ready, you can go work on the math review worksheet, and I'll bring the class back.
Okay.
All right, cool. Thank you. Here you go. Nice job.
I'm finished.
Great, Nora. Thanks for finishing your math activity. I'm going to give you this debrief form, and you can use this to tell me about what happened earlier, okay? And just let me know when you're done.
I'm done.
Great. Thanks for completing the debriefing form, Nora.
So you saw that Mr. Santini gave Nora time and space to cool down without making any suggestions to her. This is really important because if we start even just a conversation with a student, it can sort of feel like a demand and re-escalate emotions and behavior very quickly. So Mr. Santini waited for quite some time until Nora looked pretty calm and ready before he approached her, and then just made the suggestion of going to the peace corner. Now, to use something like the peace corner, and we saw this earlier as a de-escalation strategy during the cycle, um, a teacher has to have already established some procedures for use. And in this case, she's the only one in the classroom, so it's no big deal to go over there. But notice that there are things that happen in the peace corner. He said, maybe you can try some deep breathing. If Nora had never practiced deep breathing before, this wouldn't have been very helpful. But this teacher has taught some mindfulness strategies outside of the context of a stressful situation, which helps students to apply those strategies when they actually really need them after a crisis like that. So this is another example, kind of like the procedure where the class left the room in an orderly manner during the crisis. This is another procedure that needs to have been taught in advance. Very important. And these skills are really good to teach students, particularly students who are likely to experience crises, but all students. So this can be something that's taught class-wide. So the next thing Mr. Santini does after giving Nora another 10 minutes or whatever the adequate time is, if this is you dealing with one of your students, to really calm down, then it's time to reintegrate Nora back into instruction. So it's good to give an instructional activity. In Nora's case, this is directly related to what they're working on before, because the trigger had nothing to do with the content of the assignment so much as the delay to the assignment. So she gets to go work on that math review sheet that she wanted to get to earlier, while Mr. Santini brings the class back, because remember, they're out of the room. And so this all needs to be reconciled. And he checked in with Nora about that. And if Nora had said, no, I'm not ready for the class to come back in, that's a really important report from the student to take into account. Because if she's actually aware enough to say she's not ready, then bringing the class back too early might mean re-escalation. It might not, but it is a little bit of a risk. Now that Nora has been reintegrated with the class and has engaged with the instructional activity, the math review sheet, and has finished with that, Mr. Santini asks her to complete a debriefing form. And this form is really important and should be completed during this de-escalation stage where the student's behavior is looking calm, relatively relaxed, no signs of re-escalation. Those signs or that calmness communicates that they're prepared to think through the conflict that happened earlier, the crisis that happened earlier. And so this form is going to help Nora to identify triggers and what her behavior looked like and how it worked out for her, and will be used later during recovery to structure a debriefing conversation.
Take some time to make sure that your form is caught up. We're entering our final phase of the escalation model. Recovery is sometimes overlooked as its own phase because we tend to think the incident is now over. Recovery is a very important phase and should be attended to because this is when some active learning can take place, and this is where you can switch your focus off of the immediate needs of the moment and begin to look at what to do next time. If our initial trigger was a writing activity, then we can begin to discuss what to do the next time we are going to do a writing activity. How do we know we're in recovery? Well, the student in question is beginning to act more like they did during the initial calm phase. We use that kind of bell curve graphic because it helps us to understand the similarities and strategies and what is going on in a child's brain. That's why some strategies during agitation and acceleration look similar to those in de-escalation. The same goes with recovery and calm. Now that our student is back at their baseline, we can start to think about transitioning back to our normal routines and expectations. Things that we can focus on are providing a strong focus on normal routines. We really should be attending to any appropriate student behaviors at this point, help student focus on independent tasks or activities, communicate support and the expectations that we can succeed. Do not renegotiate assigned consequences that may have been discussed earlier. Acknowledge problem-solving behaviors and teach alternative responses at a later time in the hopes that a student can use those the next time a stressful situation happens. One of the most important tasks we have once a student is in recovery is to debrief with them about the situation. The ultimate goal here is to have students be able to self-identify their own phases of escalation and hopefully either implement their own de-escalation strategies or be open to mild prompts from you to use them. What can this look like? Well, during a debriefing session, we can use proactive strategies designed to help the student problem solve. We can have a brief meeting, usually conducted after the student has successfully been calm and integrated back into the classroom. You can consider and analyze events that led up to the crisis, establish alternative responses to those triggers to replace the problem behaviors. You may use debriefing checklists or even a written plan, but make sure that debriefing is not used as a consequence or seen as punitive by the student. Here is our last video with Nora. Pay attention to what behaviors you can see from her and the staff. It's not uncommon for students in this phase to appear embarrassed or guarded. It's also common if they try to act as if nothing had happened.
Hey, let's talk through what happened earlier. Can we start with your reflection?
Okay.
Great. I see that you were frustrated by having to wait to do your math work. It was hard to hear other students ask questions that you already knew the answers to. I can totally understand that. What did you do?
I talked out. Then I yelled and I knocked over my chair.
I saw that too. How did that work out? How do you feel about the result?
I feel embarrassed and I wish I hadn't done it.
Yeah. What do you think about you could do the next time? If you need some ideas, I could help you.
Maybe I could ask to work ahead.
Nice, that's a super idea. How about I find some challenging activities for you to keep at your desk just for times like this?
Okay.
Also, remember you always have the option to go to the Peace Corner and use the activities over there.
Okay.
Great. Now, here's the thing. Whenever a student shows any unsafe behavior in the classroom, the teacher needs to call home and write an office referral. Okay, I just want to make sure you're aware of that so it's not a surprise. Do you have any questions about that?
No, I get it.
Great. Before we move on, is there anything else you need or want me to know? Anything else that I could help make you way better the next time?
I don't know. I'm always waiting for adults to help other kids so they can help me.
That's right, you have a baby sister.
Yeah, she gets all the attention.
I'm sorry to hear that. That must be pretty hard. If you ever want to talk about that, we totally can.
Okay.
How are you feeling now?
I feel a little bit embarrassed, but I'm feeling a lot better.
That's totally understandable. I'm glad you're feeling better. And I just want you to know I'm very glad to have you in my class.
Thank you.
Mr. Santini is leading a debriefing conversation with Nora. And the first step of this conversation is to look at the form and kind of come to an agreement on what happened. And, you know, Mr. Santini uses language like, I see that you felt this way. I saw that too. He kind of validates the experience of the student to the extent that he can, and asks her some questions about what she needed, why it happened, and whether it actually solved the problem. And this really helps a student to develop the ability to self-reflect, and also in the future to notice when they are beginning to escalate, to observe those signs in themselves, and this facilitates them seeking solutions in the future. Mr. Santini and Nora now continue this conversation. They spent the first part discussing what happened to help develop Nora's ability to detect when she needs a change in her environment. So she needs to know what her triggers are, just like Mr. Santini does. That conversation's helpful for both of them. But now what they need to build on that is an idea of what to do once one or both of them detects that there is a need for a change. So they work together to identify some strategies. And Nora is able right out of the gate to make a suggestion that's a pretty good one, which is, well, maybe I can ask to move on. So much like asking for help, right? But matched to her triggering scenario, having to wait. And Mr. Santini reinforces her engagement with this conversation by saying, that's a great idea, and then builds on it by suggesting that he, takes an active role and compiles, a set of activities that he can have on hand to give her in a situation like that. In addition, he says, alternatively, you can always go take a break in the Peace Corner. And this is a really good idea. It's beneficial to have that break available, not only for Nora, but for other students in the classroom. And again, it's just important that if you're going to use something like a break area or Peace Corner, that you have explicitly taught procedures for entering and exiting and using it to the class. The next stage in this conversation is a tricky one, and it can be very tempting to put this off for later, or maybe to not even talk with the student about it and just enact the consequence. But Mr. Santini goes ahead and lets Nora know what has to happen according to school or classroom policies in response to her severe challenging behavior, kicking the desk, knocking things over. That stuff was dangerous to Nora and to other students. But he does it compassionately. And I like his language here of like, here's the things. He's kind of preparing her for bad news, but still ending on a positive note, and one in which he's kind of checking in, like, does that make sense to you? And Nora says yes. And if she has questions, she can ask them. But what's important is that he's kind of polite but firm about these consequences. I will also add that it can be really tempting to use this part of the conversation. If you're not one of those teachers who wants to avoid this conversation, you might be one of those teachers who's tempted to kind of guilt and shame in an effort to prevent the student from doing this again. And I would just caution you to remind yourself to be polite but firm. Those consequences will speak for themselves. So in this final segment of the debrief conversation, Mr. Santini, addresses a lot of different things. One is discussing other issues or non-school-based issues, like, hey, sort of an acknowledgement of like, this isn't necessarily how you normally react, even when your peers ask a lot of questions. Like, are there other things going on I should know about? So this is an opportunity not only to learn about non-school-based triggers, but also to repair and build a relationship and communicate that you care about what's going on with a student outside of school. So this part of the conversation serves multiple purposes in that sense. In addition, Mr. Santini really explicitly offers support for the student by saying, hey, if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. And also communicate support by checking in on how she's feeling. How are you feeling now? Oh, I can understand that you're feeling that way, a little embarrassed. And ends by affirming Nora and her role in the classroom and her belonging in the classroom. And students need to feel that sense of belonging to really thrive. So I think that's a really nice place for Mr. Santini to end. And it's not always easy to do that. It's really reasonable for a teacher at even at this point during recovery. Maybe you haven't had enough time to recover and the student has. And if it's at all possible to delay this conversation until you both have, even better. But sometimes we have to kind of just dig deep and find that empathy, even though we're very reasonably stressed out by what happened earlier. But this really is a situation where if we can kind of rise above our own emotions and have this supportive conversation that is clear, but helps repair the relationship, it just has that longer term payoff, even though it can be hard in the short term. And sometimes it isn't hard in the short term. It does just feel good to make up.
Take some time to reflect on what you've watched and complete the behavior response intervention plan. This slide is one of my favorites. This boils everything we've just reviewed down into one page. Across the top in red, you'll see the phases we've just discussed. One thing I really like about this slide is the portion on what is happening in a student's brain during each phase. Those of you with some background in trauma-informed practices will recognize this. The portion in green spells out some strategies for us to use, and the next part in orange shows some pre-taught routines that we can use to further prevent and de-escalate. The last section speaks to what can be done on a systems level to help you maintain a safe and stable learning environment for your students. In this next section, we'll look at some behavioral terms, concepts, and strategies. This graphic is in contrast to the conflict cycle we reviewed earlier. This cycle shows how a well-regulated teacher is able to show dysregulated students some empathy. This helps overall relationships. Good overall relationships and an empathetic adult help students to be more regulated, which results in a teacher who is more easily regulated themselves. Here's that same information in a slightly different layout. I like that the last bullet lays out that regulation is de-escalation. There was a study at an alternative school where each student was given a heart monitor to track their beats per minute because beats per minute is directly connected to brain function. The staff wouldn't speak to students about issues until they were at a certain heartbeat range. This forced students to ultimately regulate their brain function before processing issues. They saw a dramatic decrease in acting out behaviors. One thing you can do for students in crisis is to affirm the emotion that they seem to be experiencing. Sometimes we don't want to say empathetic things because we're more concerned with the behavior that's being displayed. It's okay to say things like, "It seems like that made you really upset," after a student says, "I hate this effing teacher." Dysregulation could look different in different people. Remember that people in distress and crisis tend to solicit those same emotions out of those around them. This goes both ways, so making sure that you are okay is crucial when dealing with stressful situations. Remember our talk about being the thermostat for our students? As you actively work to regulate yourself in stressful situations, you're actually teaching and modeling how self-regulation looks in real time. Self-regulation is the ability to manage our emotions and behavior in accordance with the demands of the situation. It includes being able to resist highly emotional reactions to upsetting stimuli, to calm yourself down when you get upset, to adjust to a change in expectations, and to handle frustration without an outburst. Try to think about some real-life actionable steps you can take to regulate yourself when you're upset. Take some time to pre-plan your own regulation strategies for stressful moments that are likely to happen throughout a school day. We tend to wait until those moments happen and then hope to retrieve a strategy, but having one thought out in advance makes it more likely that we'll be able to implement our own effective strategies when we need them. I hope that all this talk about regulation helps you understand how managing our own stress will ultimately help us bring a sense of calm to situations that are anything but. We all know the issues and problems that our students bring with them each day into our classrooms. So please don't think that we are solely responsible for fixing all of our community's woes. But I hope that we walk away from today with a concrete understanding of how our adult behaviors are key in keeping students from going around and around that conflict cycle referenced earlier. This information about regulation and reciprocity are just steps to take to break that cycle as quickly as possible. A quick strategy to help us in the moment to regulate ourselves is the stop, drop, soften approach. So stop, take one deep inhale and exhale, drop your shoulders because I bet you didn't even notice that they were tense, soften your belly, and then approach the student with kindness. You can also think about a breathing technique that works for you. Some people carry things like a worry stone in their pocket that they can rub when they're nervous. You could have a pre-planned thought or prayer or mantra that you quietly say to yourself. I know of a local administrator who was always stressed during a reoccurring Zoom meeting. So he taped a picture of his dog in the top right corner of his laptop. He said looking at it made him happy and it helped him get through those meetings. A few other things that you can do to regulate yourself in stressful moments. Stand or sit really still. Plant your feet on the ground with purpose. Squeeze your muscles tightly and count to 5 and then release them. Or release and squeeze and let go with a big sigh. You can imagine a place where you're feeling happy or relaxed. Think about what you can see, hear, smell, and touch, where you are. Pretend to be there until you feel chillaxed in your head. Those are some in-the-moment strategies, but there are long-term strategies to help with regulation as well. You can make sure you stay active, go for walks, do other exercise like yoga. You can look at apps like the gratitude list, keep a piece of paper on your desk, or at the end of the day, write down what's right, what's done, and what felt good. And then also progressive muscle relaxation is a great one as well. Here are some things that can actually help you with that long-term regulation for yourself. You can think about mindfulness and meditation and things, guided meditation apps and routines for regulation. You should see some links on the side here that can help you get to these apps. Here are some practical things that you can do on a daily basis to set the stage for an increase in positive behaviors. The first thing is to be explicit with classroom routines. Taking the time to teach students what you expect from them will save you a lot of time that you would otherwise spend redirecting. Preventative prompts are when you remind students of an expectation just before you begin that activity. One of my favorite strategies, because it's one of the most effective, is to make sure we're addressing 5 positive behaviors for every 1 negative behavior that we have to address. Using individual and group contingency reinforcers is another great way to increase positive behaviors in students. On this slide, you'll see how to develop a continuum of strategies that we can use to respond to behavioral errors. You can see the arrow goes from left to right, and it also goes in intensity. So for early mild behaviors, we might use some planned ignoring or proximity control, some just direct eye contact or signaling or nonverbal cues. These are things to just let students know that you're kind of paying attention to them, and sometimes that's enough of a cue that they begin to get on task. We could praise the appropriateness of students around the student who might be misbehaving. So if one student's talking, I might tell the other two, I really like how they're sitting quietly. I might praise approximations or use some mild redirection or specific error correction. If need be, as you can see, we get a little more intense on the other side. I might actually have to reteach some routines or procedures. It's always good to give students choice. They're more likely to comply with what you're asking if they've chosen one of the activities. You can begin to use some of those de-escalation techniques that we talked about earlier. For those of you well-informed with trauma-informed practices, you've heard the idea of regulating, relating, and reasoning with students. So regulating their heart rate and brain function, relate to them emotionally, and then you can start to reason with them. And these last 3 are effective questioning, so really asking a student about how they feel in those moments. You could use responsive community circles where students are sitting and discussing things that have been upsetting in their school day, or formal conferencing, which is a little more one-on-one version of that same thing. I encourage you to take this a step further and use a new blank form to fill it out thinking about that student from the ABC chart that you completed at the beginning of this training. Hopefully, by dissecting what was going on during that student's last escalation, you can get a better understanding of how to attend to those earlier phases and do some preventative work. Thank you for your time and attention while we discuss the strategies for diffusing and preventing challenging behaviors. To finish up, please complete the quiz via the link on the side of this video. Thanks so much.